Ugh. Let the record show that I recorded this, like, a while ago. I recorded this video, I spoke really well, I was super proud of it, and then I go and I look back at the footage. The entire thing is out of focus. Like, even more so than my usual videos are out of focus, because my camera doesn't have one of those viewfinder things. I just gotta guess. So the whole thing's out of focus. So I'm like, it's no big deal. It's no big deal. I'll just refilm it. And then life happens, and I didn't refilm it. And now, Scarlett Johansson has exited Rub and Tug. Which brings me to the point of this video, which was gonna be Scarlett Johansson being in Rub and Tug. But now she's not. So what the hell am I supposed to talk about? We're gonna talk about how she was almost playing a transgender man in Rub and Tug. So if you missed that little blip on the radar of LGBTQ+ news, Scarlett Johansson accepted the role of historical trans man Tex Gill, I think was his name, in the upcoming movie Rub and Tug, directed by the same guy who cast her as a Japanese woman in Ghost in the Shell. More on that later. And she got huge backlash for that decision for good reason. I will say, I don't think she deserved all of it. She got all of it because she was the face of it, and people usually forget that other people make those decisions. Like, you can blame her for accepting the role, but you gotta go at the director for offering it to her and the casting people in the studio for thinking that was okay. Now, we need to talk about how we came to this point, because it's not like this is out of the blue. We've had cis people playing trans people for a long time, and there was a time where I may have defended that. For example, I made a video right after I saw The Danish Girl, talking about how I felt about that. Now, if you're thinking, oh, I never saw that video, it's because I never posted it. Because I was super awkward and weird, and I was like 12. Okay, so I was 17, but whatever. Point is at the time, my thoughts were, the character in Danish Girl spends the majority of the film dressed like a man, being referred to as a man, and it might have just been easier to show that full transition, or not even a full transition, because tragically she passes away before she's able to fully transition. And that, again, historical fact, this is what happened to her. So I was like, maybe it makes sense for Eddie Redmayne to do it. And then trans issues came to the forefront, and I started learning more about it. And I don't fully disagree with everything I said, but now I realize that a trans person can portray that just as easily, not to mention the fact there are so many trans actors out there. Why would you cast a cis person? And if you have to look up what cis is, it's probably you. Just putting that out there. But no, really, cis is short for cisgender, which means you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. There are trans actors out there just not getting roles because they're being discriminated against because they're trans. So for Hollywood to say, oh, we're going to tell this awesome historical story about this really cool person who was trans, but we're not going to let a trans person tell it, that's like dangling a bone in front of the trans community and then snatching it away. You had this opportunity to tell an amazing story by and for trans people, and then you were like, but we're not super sure about it, so we're not going to cast a trans person. It could have been something so cool for the trans community where it's a story about a trans person, but not about being trans, if that makes sense. Like, the whole centerpiece of the film isn't their journey or whatnot. It's a gangster film that happens to have a trans protagonist. And that, in my opinion, is the coolest kind of diversity, when it's not all about that identity. It's just a protagonist that factors in that part of their identity into their whole story. But no. They initially made that decision to cast a cis woman. And the fact that they've backtracked means, at minimum, they realize people are upset with what they did. Even if they don't actually think what they did was a problem, they've recognized that people were upset enough that it would be smartest for them to backtrack. At minimum, they've acknowledged that they've upset people. And that's great. Baby steps. Maybe Scarlett Johansson isn't going to become a spokesperson for the trans community, but at minimum, she acknowledged that what she was doing was a problem, and she stepped away. Where the film goes from here is up to the studios and up to Hollywood, but as we've seen a lot lately, they're not always the smartest with making those decisions. What's a really good example? Exodus, Gods of Egypt. When Ridley Scott cast Whiteys 1 and 2 to play Ramesses and Moses, Egyptians from Egypt, which is in Africa, Because filmmakers say, oh, you can't sell it without big names. You need big names attached to a project in order to sell it. Here's a hot take for you. If you can't sell your movie, or if you feel like you can't sell your movie without attaching a big name to it, maybe you don't have a really good movie. Maybe you need to go back over it and see what you can do to make it strong on its own. If you need the crutch of celebrity, maybe you got some things to work over so your film can stand on its own two legs. And that's not even talking about how there are plenty of minority big names out there. And there could be even more if filmmakers would take chances on them and make them into big names. But no, everyone's so terrified of making a flop that they end up forcing it into being something that's got something for everybody. I hate that phrase. This movie has something for everybody. That just means it has nothing. That means it's all over the place. It's trying to be too many things. It's trying to have such wide appeal that everyone's going to walk out of it going, it was okay. Studios right now are so afraid of making something that's too niche or too controversial. They're making these broad appealing films that end up, yeah, sure, they make a lot of money, but they're entirely mediocre and forgettable. And you see attempts at making something a bit different that still end up falling flat. What it all seems like it comes back to me is that filmmakers don't have confidence in what they're making anymore. And that's really sad, because when you see something that you can tell they made with vision and that was made with real creative control and not a whole lot of meddling from the studios, you get really cool, interesting movies. Maybe they're not blockbusters, maybe they're not going to be the new highest grossing film of all time, but they're interesting and people remember them. So studios just keep making these cookie cutter films that are all star-studded, explosion-filled, plotless movies, hoping that something will catch, and it makes a bunch of money and they say, great, we're going to do it all over again, except this time we're going to switch out Tom Cruise with Jason Statham and call it a day. But it's not going to last. Eventually, the movie business is going to crash, because this is what has always happened with business and with film, especially. If there's one thing I've learned at film school, it's that things get crazy, and then the film industry crashes, and then that's when real creativity comes back. Hopefully that'll be right when I enter the workforce. But anyway, I just really wish that movies and studios would cut the BS. If you want to tell a trans story, tell a trans story. Commit to it. Get trans people in the writer's room. Get trans actors. Commit to it. Actually do something worthwhile. Because if you do something like that, I promise you the trans community will remember it. They will say, this is the movie that brought us to the forefront. This was the pinnacle film, whatever. It could be such a great way to bring trans writers and actors and other artists to the forefront if they would commit to it. But everyone's too scared. So if you want to tell a story about an oppressed minority, honestly, it's your responsibility to fill that role with someone from that group. And if you don't do that, it tells me one of two things. Either you feel that you as a filmmaker don't have what it takes to humanize them enough to the point where an audience can empathize, or you don't feel that that kind of person can actually be humanized enough for an audience to empathize. You pick. This episode has been brought to you by my sister's blog, where I'm currently a guest writer while she does other things. Link in the description.